Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at round number 5 of the Grand Swiss, which is being held here in the Isle of Man, a crown dependency of the United Kingdom. Now, in this 5th round, I'm playing against Alireza Sarana from Russia. He is a player that I've played many times online, very specifically in Titled Tuesday. He plays under the account Mechanic. We've had many epic battles, and he's someone that I'm very familiar with, which is actually quite nice, all things considered. So, in this game, I start by playing the move d4. We get knight f6, c4, and e6. Now, those of you guys who've looked at my games online, and actually when I played Sarana, even the World Rapid and Blitz tournament a few years back, I almost always play e4. But the fact that Sarana had actually played some multiple openings and not just his beloved Najdorf, he had played, I think, e5 and Petrov against Arjun earlier in the tournament, I just wasn't really in the mood. So, I go knight f3, we get d5 here, and now I play g3, and the move bishop b4 is played by Alexei. Now, in this game, I decided to play this Catalan system. It's something that I have played very sparingly over the years, but I think the last time I played it seriously might have been all the way back in the 2015 United States Chess Championship against Gregory Kaidanov. Now, of course, everybody prepares for multiple setups, different openings, but nonetheless, I thought it would be a nice surprise. So we get bishop b4 check. I play bishop d2, bishop e7, and now I play bishop g2. We get castles, knight bd7, and here I decide to play the move bishop c3. Now, I've played this position from both sides many times over the years, and until recently, I wasn't even aware that this move bishop c3 existed. But thanks to sites such as Chessable and other online platforms, I actually found some various ideas featuring bishop c3. So I decided to play bishop c3 here, and the reason is quite simple. I've already moved the bishop to d2, so I can't easily put the bishop on the natural square, which usually would be something like b3 and bishop b2 here. So if I can't do that, then why not put the bishop on this diagonal anyway, and try to put the knight on d2 and finish my development this way, because now the bishop is on its natural diagonal. So after bishop c3, Sarana decides to play b6, which is the best move. And now I switch it up completely by trading on d5 and going bishop d2 back. Now, those of you guys who are watching this video are like, wait, what are you doing? You just said you put the bishop on c3 to put it on the right diagonal. Now you're going back to d2. Why are you wasting tempo? You played 1, 2, 3. You're losing time. What are you doing? Now, the reason I'm able to actually do this is that in the game of chess, sometimes tempos don't matter, and computers actually will say that pretty much anything is playable as long as you play the best moves. So obviously, if I can play the best moves, who cares if I waste time going bishop c3 and bishop d2? But secondarily, and this is much more important, my opponent does not play the Queen's Indian. And what has happened here after bishop b7, knight c3, knight to e4, and bishop f4 is that we're essentially in a Queen's Indian where white has fianchettoed the bishop. Now, to tell you guys exactly what I mean by that, after knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, black can play b6 here, and after a move like g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop e7, let's say castles, knight c3, and d5, you'll notice that this is the exact same structure. The pawns are on a7, b6, c7, d5, and black's bishops are on the same two squares with e7 and b7, and white normally will play a move like bishop f4 here. Now, Sarana does not play the Queen's Indian. So when we get to this position here after knight c3, knight e4, and bishop to f4, Sarana is sort of out of his comfort zone because the pawn structure is a little bit different. And so I'm hoping that he doesn't know what the most precise moves and ideas are because he simply doesn't play the system at all. Unfortunately, Sarana keeps moving quickly. He plays knight f6, I play rook c1, and now he plays this move c5. Now, in retrospect here, because I had not actually looked at this knight e4 move, I probably should have played something like h4 here, followed by something like rook e8 and e3 here. And generally, the computer thinks this is fine, but there are two problems. First of all, it looks a little bit scary here because this bishop could potentially get trapped by a move like h6 and g5. Also, those of you guys who watched my recap yesterday, you will recall that in a very similar structure, my opponent Amin played h4, creating a big weakness on g4 down the road in that game. And so for those two reasons, it didn't feel quite right. So I play rook c1 instead, trying to put pressure on the c file. We get the move c5, and now I play the move knight d2 after a very long thing. Now, up to this point, I was moving very quickly, but here I spent over 35 minutes before playing this move, and the reason is I was simply not happy with my position. My first instinct was to take on c5, but I realized that after knight takes c3, rook takes c3, and b takes c5, black suddenly has some grip over the center here with ideas like d4 to open the scope, and I simply was not happy with the possibilities that I had here. I looked at moves like knight e5 and queen c8, and it simply didn't feel right. So for that reason, I spent a lot of time and played knight d2 instead, with a simple plan of exchanging these knights off the board. We get knight takes c3, rook takes c3, and now Sarana plays this move queen d7. Now you may be wondering, why doesn't black take the pawn on d4? If black were to take on d4 after this move rook c2, let's say black goes rook e8, I'm able to play knight b3, recapturing this pawn in the center that I'm down, but also getting this nice outpost and keeping a lot of pressure on this long diagonal for my bishop on g2. So, Sarana plays queen d7. Now I decide to take on c5 because I can no longer keep the tension going. If I play a move like e3 here, I think black can play c4 with ideas like b5, b4, and a very quick pawn storm on the queen side. And I'm not able to open up the center with e4 because black is covering the square with 3 pieces. So, I decided to trade on c5, but now I can reroute my knight to b3, and I put pressure on the pawns on c5 and d5. Sarana plays rook a c8, which I think is a slight inaccuracy maybe, and now I go bishop to g5, and here Sarana blunders with this move d4. Now, I think at this point, Serrano was feeling a little bit too optimistic. He had evened out the time. He was down about 25 minutes early, and he felt like he was simply better here, and he gets a little bit careless with this move d4. Now, on first glance, it makes a lot of sense here. You open up the diagonal. You really don't want to go c4 because after knight d4, the knight is on this great outposted square of d4, and the pawns on d5 and c4 cannot attack the knight, whereas back here, the pawn covers this d4 square. But the computer says after knight d4, you can play something like h6 here, probably takes an e3, and I would say that I don't think white should be worse here because you have a lot of pressure on d5, but black also has the two b's, and I don't think white can ever be better. Now, this was my intention to go for this, and I figured probably it'll be a draw. If he makes a mistake, maybe I can get chances. But realistically, this is what I was expecting. But then when Sarana plays d4, he allows me to take the bishop on b7. Black cannot take the rook on c3 because then I trade these queens. I take the bishop on e7, and uh-oh, spaghetti, black will lose one of the two rooks, and with it the game. So Sarana plays queen takes bishop, and now I go rook c4, and already black has some serious problems because now my knight on b3 is simply a great piece. It pressures both of the pawns on c5 and d4, and black can no longer move the rook here, so these two pawns will be an issue for the rest of the game. So Sarana plays knight to d5 here, and now I decide to trade the bishops, and I find this great move, queen to c1, which is going to win the pawn on c5. Now, if I win the base of the chain on c5, the d4 pawn will fall afterwards. So Sarana plays knight b6, and now I play rook c2. I could have played the move rook takes c5 here, but after this move rook takes c5, queen takes c5, queen takes e2, queen takes d4, and knight c4, I thought I was still much better here, but I wasn't sure how to win the game. Computer says after knight c1, queen c2, I think I have like queen d3, which I guess is winning, but I was very worried that this knight was jumping to d2, and there were all kinds of forks in the position. So, I play rook c2 instead, guarding the pawn at e2, but still asking black a big question of what he's going to do about these two pawns. So Sarana plays rook e8 here. I take this pawn, and now he goes h5. The idea for Sarana is he's giving up the pawn on c5, but he has ideas like h4, h3, and maybe a lolly checkmate on g2. And additionally, I always have this weakness on e2, and there's pressure on the c file as well, so it's not so easy to untangle. So here I play rook to d1. Now, it's worth noting that if I had seen this position after queen to e5 in my analysis earlier, I probably would not have played rook c2. I probably would have played rook c5, but in my analysis, when I calculated this at the time, I thought after rook to d1, I was simply close to winning because I did not see this queen e5 move, which guards the pawn on d4 and still puts pressure on the pawn on e2 as well. I saw moves like queen f6, for example, where I can play knight d3 or even queen d2, and the d pawn is going to fall right away. But after queen to e5, it's a much different story here, because if I play knight d3 now, black can trade the rooks and win the pawn on e2 and probably save the game. So I play rook to d2, guarding the pawn and intending to retreat my knight back to d3. We get h4, knight to d3, queen e6 is played, and now I play this move a3. Sarana goes knight d5, and here I make a huge mistake with this move knight to c5. Now in this position, black has really one idea. Or two ideas, I should say. Either he trades the pawn on g3 or he plays h3 and tries to checkmate me on the light squares. So because black has these ideas, there's some pressure on the e2 pawn as well. What I should do here is simply trade the rooks, because with less pieces on the board, any of these ideas become far less effective. And if black plays a move like rook e8 back here, for example, I can go queen g5. My rook on c2 is amazing. It guards the pawn on e2. It also covers the open c file. active queen. Knight is perfectly placed, and I should probably win this game very simply. Instead, I play knight c5, and the reason I play this move is I thought that Sarana had to play the move queen to e5 here, and after knight to b3, I'm going to win this pawn on d4, be up 2 pawns, and coast to victory. But it's kind of, in a way, ironic, because when I played knight c5, in this position, I missed that black does not have to play queen e5, whereas earlier, when I went for this whole line, the one move that I missed was queen e5. So I missed queen e5 in the position where it mattered, and then later on, I thought that queen e5 was the only move when it's not. Now, here Sarana misses a huge opportunity when he plays the move queen h3. Computer says that after queen to g4, black is actually quite close to drawing. This is one line where black is doing very well. Another line which is kind of fantastic is black can play rook takes c5, sacking the rook. And after rook takes c5, h takes g3. If I take with the f pawn here, black can play queen to e3, and after I go king to f1, queen e4, black has all kinds of threats with the knight and the queen, and the computer says this is simply winning. And if I take with the h pawn, there's knight to f4 here, trying to take this pawn on e2. And if I play a move like queen to d1 here, I believe that black can go queen h3, queen f1, queen g4. There's maximum pressure towards the pawn on e2. Black even has an idea like rook e3 maybe here, and black can sack another rook, and the computer says this is simply a draw in the resulting position. So, very hard to see. Obviously, we're low on time. It's not what you expect. So, Sarana instead plays queen h3, which is a mistake, because now I can go queen to f1, queen to f5, and knight to d3, resetting the position at least to some degree and still keeping an advantage. Now, I'm feeling much better here because now I know at least one set of rooks will come off the board. But again, keep in mind that all the way back here, I could have basically had the same position with one set of rooks already off. So clearly, I've done something wrong. I knew I had done something wrong during the game, but nonetheless, I still am up a pawn. So we get h3 here, which is a move that I kind of expected from Sarana. Computer says after knight to f6 here, for example, let's say rook c8, and rook to d1. Apparently, after, I guess, rook to e8 back, black is only a little bit worse here. I don't really know why black is only a little bit worse, but for a human, it doesn't really make sense to trade off rooks and go back to e8. You feel like you need to be active because you are down a pawn. Now, computers, of course, don't care at all about material. They don't have these thoughts. They don't worry about being down a pawn because they just play the best move every time. And what's the big deal? And if you do play the best move every time, even down a pawn, you're probably still not going to lose most of the time. But we as humans, we look at the game much more in terms of pure calculation, but then also material balance and what are the themes that you're playing for. So for Sarana, he wants to be very active and try to create a checkmate and keep a lot of pressure and active play in the position. So after h3, I play knight e1, which is also apparently a mistake. Computer wants rook c8, and queen d1 to try and play rook c2, trading off the rooks. But to me, I thought knight e1 made sense because now I guard the rook. d4 is super weak, and I can reroute the knight back to f3. Now, the computer here says that after g5, apparently after rook c8, and knight to f3 here, after g4, knight takes d4 and queen e4, apparently, white is only very slightly better here because white has a lot of problems due to the checkmate threats on g2. Also, if I play a move like a4 after rook to c1, I simply lose the game because of this checkmate threat. And if I play rook to d1 here, black can just play a move like a6 waiting. If I ever go f3, I lose in the e3 square. And if I ever play e3 here after, say, king g7, I can never really play f3 because then the e3 pawn falls. And so my queen is glued to f1 forever. I can't push the pawns in the center. And the computer thinks that black is actually very close to drawing the game. But for a human, not realistic. So Sarana plays knight f6, I trade the rooks, and now I go knight to f3, trying to win the second pawn on d4. Sarana plays knight to e4, I go rook to d1, and now he plays rook d8, and finally I'm able to take this pawn on d4, and now I'm up 2 pawns in this late middle game, entering the endgame phase, and with limited material on the board, I feel pretty good. So we get queen to c5. I play e3, guarding the knight. Now, to point this out, when Sarana played queen c5, this resulting endgame that occurs with the knights, I did see it. So here I play e3, he goes knight d2, queen d1, and now he plays queen d5, trying to checkmate desperately, because if I can consolidate with the 2 extra pawns, I am going to win the game. Now he finds queen a2, the only move in the position. If black plays knight c4, I can go queen b3, pinning the knight, bring the king closer to the center, and I will mop it up very soon. So we get queen a2, and now I have to play the move king f2. If I play this move queen takes d2, after queen b1, king f2, and queen h1, suddenly black is no longer even worse because he's going to win this pawn on h2, and then this h pawn is coming down the board really, really quickly. So I go king f2 here, Sarana takes. Now I play queen c2, forcing my opponent to trade the queens off, or else he will lose the horse. So he trades the queens, and now he goes f5. And when I was calculating this about 6 moves earlier, I figured with this weak pawn on h3 that I can get to very quickly, this knight endgame must be winning. So here I go g4, intending to bring the king over to g3 and win the pawn on h3. We got takes, king f7, king g3, and now Sarana shocked me with this move, king f6. Now, I'd not seen this idea at all. The two ideas I looked at were something like king e6, takes, king d5, king g3, king e4, and I think after h4, king d3 here, I was just going to play knight d4, because if he takes, I get knight f5, take, and I push p, win the game very easily. And I also thought that maybe he could play something like g5, king g3, and something like king f6. So if I go h4, knight e4, he can always just check me all over the board. And if I'm not careful and I try to capture the horse, he can take, and after king d2, h3, h2, h1, I lose the game. But he plays king g5 instead, which I had not seen. But luckily, I still have resources. So I go a4 here. Important move. So I move the knight. Knight c4 will attack both of these pawns at the same time. And more importantly, from a conceptual standpoint, the most important thing for me to do is keep this a pawn on the board. If I get some position like this, for example, even though I'm up a pawn here with the 3 versus 2, black has this outside pawn pushing up the a file very quickly, and my knight will get distracted having to stop the pawn, and black will draw very easily. So I realize here from a general standpoint, I need to keep this a pawn on the board. I can lose other pawns on the king side so long as I keep the a pawn alive. We get knight to e4, knight d4, knight f2, and I go king g3, knight e4, and now I make the repetition because due to the time control, we get more time at move 60, so it's better to get one move closer because I am actually down on the clock, but also I gain an extra 30 seconds, which could be invaluable down the road. So I do the repetition. Of course, I had no intention of making the draw with 2 extra pawns. I go king f3, knight d2, king e2, knight e4, and now I play this move a5, which is also very important. Now, what I understood here is that I'm going to try to win this pawn on a7, but also I have this e pawn, which can start going up the board very soon, because of course, black has to take this pawn on g4. I go knight c6, attacking the pawn on a7. We get a6, and now I play the move king to d3. Now, at this point, I was pretty sure that this has to technically be winning, but again, you want to make sure to not make a mistake. So Sarana goes knight d6. Now I push this e pawn up the board, and he plays move king h3, which effectively loses the game immediately, but there's really nothing else black can do. If you go king f4, then I can play e5. If you play knight b5, for example, I go king c4, king f5, knight d4, and this king and pawn endgame is simply winning. And if you go like knight e8 here, now I can go king c4 again. If you go king f5, king d5, I'm going to be able to push this e pawn up the board or even go after this a6 pawn, and it's totally hopeless. So Sarana plays king h3. Now, the one good thing about king h3 is that it forces me to find a winning line. If there is no winning line, black intends to take this pawn and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, push p on the g file, and make a queen. So I play e5, we get knight to e8, and now I play e6. Sarana takes on h2, knight b4, g5, and I calculate a 4 sequence winning with knight a6. Now, if black were to play knight c7, I go e7, g5, sack the knight, threaten to make a queen after knight e8, knight c5, g4, knight e4. I'll sack the knight for the pawn on g3 and just push this a pawn up the board. So Sarana goes g5, I take g4, and now I have this knight's resource, knight b4, g3, knight c2, g2, and knight to e1 to catch this g2 pawn. If black leaves the pawn on g2, of course I'll sack the knight and push the pawns up the board. When black promotes to a queen, I go knight f3 check, king g3, and I take the queen. Now, I did actually calculate that if black under promotes to a knight to stop knight f3, it's still winning because after a6, knight to h3, I have a7, knight f4 check, king c2, knight c7, and e7. And even though black has these knights, I'm going to be able to get a queen because this knight cannot stop both of the wide peepo pawns. So Sarana queens, knight f3, king g3, I take, he goes king f4, and now I play a6, king e5, a7, knight c7, and e7. And once again, the wide peepos rule the day. Sarana can't stop both pawns. When he goes king d6, I can promote either pawn, but let's just say I go e8. He takes one pawn, but the other pawn becomes a queen, and I win the game. So after e7, Sarana resigns this game. I win my 3rd game in a row. I now move to, I believe, 3.5 points out of 5. Or wait, no, 3. No, I moved to, 2 draws. So I moved to 4 points out of 5 because I've won 3 and had 2 draws. So I'm on 4 out of 5. I'm tied for the lead with Andrei Yesipenko from Russia and Arjun Erigaisi from India, who also won a very nice game today against Rinat Jumabayev. So there's 3 of us tied. Tomorrow, I assume I play either Yesipenko or Arjun, but I will wait for the pairings. Now, there was another very interesting game today played also on the board next to me between Alireza Firouzja, who is chasing me in this tournament and in the ratings to qualify for the candidates, against none other than Hans Niemann. Now, Alireza playing with the white pieces opens with knight to f3. Hans plays d5. We get g3, knight to f6, bishop to g2, and e6. Now we have castles, bishop e7, d3 castles, and now we have the move rook to e1 played here by Alireza. And now Hans plays this very interesting move, knight to c6. Now, it's kind of funny because this is actually a system that Hikaru Nakamura actually played against Richard Rapport in the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin. I did a recap of that game, so those of you guys who want to find that game and listen to that recap, make sure to go back into the archives. But Hans decides that he wants to be like Hikaru by playing this knight c6 move. Now, the reason that this move is so interesting is that it actually forces White to do something he normally wouldn't want to do. When you play rook e1, the main idea of what you're aiming for is to play something like e4 with the rook supporting the pawn thrust, and down the road something like e5, h4, and we get a very classic, very classic kind of King's Indian attack system where White uses these knights, the bishop pushes pawns. This was a favorite of the former world chess champion, Robert James Fischer. So when Black plays knight c6, White can't play e4 because after takes, you swap the queens and win the pawn on e4. And if you don't play d4, say you play knight d2, now Black can play for the big Black center with e5, and these knights guard both of the pawns. So Alireza plays d4 to stop e5. It also keeps the light square bishop hemmed in on this diagonal. And now we have the move a5 played by Hans. I believe this is all pretty standard theory. I'm not sure if it's with rook e1 or knight d2, but I know that I have seen this knight c6 a5 idea before. So we get knight to c3 by Alireza, and now Hans plays knight to e4. Important move as well, because if you play a move like bishop d7, after e4, takes, White has a better structure due to more control over the center with the pawn on d4 versus the pawn on e6. And also you create the chain, and the light square bishop has no scope here. So we get knight to e4. Alireza plays knight to b5, which is definitely an unusual move, but I think Alireza was already a little bit unsure about this position, because if he plays a move like e3, for example, Black can always play f5, creating the classic stone wall in the center of the board here. Also, Black can play a4, a3, maybe even bishop b4, and it's feeling very uncomfortable here because you don't have any clear active plan. You can't push the pawn, so the rook on e1 doesn't really make a lot of sense. Very, very closed position, and for that reason, Alireza goes knight b5. We get a4 from Hans, bishop to f4 play to try and pressure the pawn on c7. We get bishop to d6. And now Alireza plays the move knight to e5. Now, bishop d6 apparently is not the best move. The computer wants this very strange move, bishop to d7, which I don't understand at all. So it looks like it just hangs a pawn after bishop c7. But I guess after queen c8, bishop f4, there's some kind of weird knight a5, knight c4 idea, and with these knights, Black is better. Again, very computerish, showing that material does not matter, much like in my game. Give up a pawn, nobody cares. Just keep making good moves. But at the end of the day, very unrealistic for a human. So we get bishop to d6, knight to e5 played here by Alireza. We get knight takes, pawn takes, and bishop to e7. And now we have this move c4. Now for Alireza, he must have been pretty happy at this point in the game, because now he has a clear plan of opening up the c file, playing on the diagonals, and at least here there is a clear plan for activity. So we get bishop to d7. Alireza plays knight to a3, retreating this knight backwards, all the while keeping pressure towards the center. We get bishop to c5, and now Alireza plays this move rook to f1, guarding the pawn on f2. Alireza could not play this move e3, I don't believe. Maybe he could have. But I think there are problems like g5 potentially down the road. It pressures bishop on f4, even c6 first, followed by g5. And your bishop on f4 looks really, really dicey. Although I guess it's kind of funny because you could play h4 with this exact same structure as in my game against Sarana, but still it doesn't look quite right. So we get rook f1, f6 played here by Hans, trying to open up the f-file and pressure the pawn on f2, as well as the pawn on b2, creating the classic right triangle. We get e takes f6, and now Hans sacks the knight with knight takes f2, which is actually the best move in the position. Now, the problem for Alireza here is that in this position, Hans doesn't have many alternatives. He can't take on f6, because after bishop takes knight, if you take, you simply lose a piece and the game. And if you take with the rook, for example, I think even takes, and bishop g5 is probably winning something here, since after rook f2, bishop takes d8, it doesn't look like there are any good fossils for Black. So Hans sacks the knight on f2. We get rook f2, bishop f2, king f2, and queen takes f6. And now the game starts to take on a completely different character, that of one where the position is opening up, but we have a very serious imbalance with white having a bishop and a knight for the rook, but white having a lot of weaknesses here. You have the weak pawns on b2 and c4, you have a weak king on f2, and black can probably use the rooks on some open files. Now, the computer does give white an advantage, but this is a very, very double-edged position where if one side makes a big mistake, the evaluation could turn in a move. So we get queen takes b2, queen c1 played here by Alireza. A logical move to try and trade the queens. Computer thinks that after knight c2, white is still a little bit better here. I don't actually know why, because after a3 and bishop a4, it looks like black should be fine, but apparently after bishop c1, white is better. I won't try to understand what 3500s are thinking. So we get queen c1, trying to trade the queens. We get queen takes e2, and now Alireza plays c takes d5, which looks correct. But again, the computer wants us to move queen c2, desperately trying to get rid of this queen, which is so close to the white king. So we get cd5 instead, ed5, bishop takes d5, king h8, and now we have the move queen c3, and Hans plays rook e8. Now, one of the problems in this position for Alireza here is that the rooks are actually on some great files, the e and the f files, and the knight is kind of off on the side of the board, not doing much. The bishops have some targets on the queen side, but the black pieces, the two rooks and the queen, combined with this light square bishop, are all very, very well placed to get very close to the white king. Meanwhile, these pawns on the queen side don't necessarily matter that much. So we get bishop takes b7. Hans plays c6 here, and now Alireza plays knight to c4, and Hans plays this move rook e4, which again is apparently a mistake. Now, knight c4 makes a lot of sense. Computer wanted knight c2, but knight c4 looks more human because you can jump to d6, e5, and e3 potentially. So we get rook e4. Computer wanted bishop e6 here because I guess if you go bishop a6, there might be some bishop d5 threatening checkmates, and the bishop is actually kind of out to lunch here because it's stuck on b7, and computer thinks that black is much better. Even knight e3, bishop h3 is actually also very, very scary with these light square weaknesses around the king. So we get rook e4, logical move, put pressure on the knight, threaten to sack for the bishop, and maybe there's some checkmate ideas on the g file. We get queen d2 here, played by Alireza, and this is a huge mistake. A double question mark move played after about a 5-minute think by Alireza. Now, it doesn't actually lose material on the spot, but it is losing the game due to a very specific sequence. Now, what the computer wanted here was this move bishop to a6. Again, a borderline impossible move to play. It guards the knight. Now, the reason this seems kind of insane to me is for two reasons. First of all, black can sack the rook, and your king is wide open here on g1. Your bishop and your knight are just simply out of play here. I guess after knight e5, queen f2, king h1, bishop f5, there's some way to survive with knight f7 and knight h6. And apparently, I guess white is better in this crazy long line here. Don't even ask me how, but apparently white is better. With limited time on the clock, I think, again, just not human at all. So we get queen d2, offering the trade of the queens. Hans takes the knight on c4. Alireza captures the bishop on d7. And now white has the two bishops for the rook. Now, if white can get this bishop back to g2, for example, white will win the game. But in this moment, there is a move that is winning on the spot for Hans here. Now, Hans also very low on time here, and he misses it by playing this move rook e2. Now, after my game, I was actually doing live commentary on my Kick channel, and the commentators asked me if I saw the win. And the move that I actually was really zeroed in on and focusing on was this move rook to e2, which Hans played. I would say that this move rook fe8, if you see the move, it's very obvious and you play it, but if you don't calculate it, rook to e2 is much more thematic because you're worried that white is going to take the pawn, get the bishops back, and consolidate the advantage. And so if you don't have a way to win on the spot, it makes more sense to be really active with rook e2, trying to go for checkmates on the second rank. So if Hans had played rook f8, he would have won this game for the following reason. If white takes on c6, there's rook e1 check, rook, takes. Doesn't matter which square the king goes to, queen f1 will be checkmate either way with the queen and the rook mating the king. So you can't take the pawn here. And if you play a move like king g2, for example, I believe that here black can go, I believe it's rook e2, king h3, and I guess queen c2 is probably the simplest human way to win the position. And after rook h1, you can go rook to e7. And after queen c6, I think there's queen f5, king g2, rook e2. And with a double stack on the e file, this will lead to a checkmate shortly. Again, it's a move that if you see it, you will play it. But if you do not see rook fe8, then rook e2 is the very obvious next alternative that you consider, especially with limited time on the clock. So we get rook e2. But now Alireza plays this move bishop c6, which is another blunder. In this position, queen d6 is actually a move that I was considering during my analysis. It's not the best move per se. There's also a move like rook c1 as well, but white has multiple ways. Instead, we get bishop takes c6, which is another mistake, because now after queen c5, king h1, and queen f2, black has the castle mania going on the 7th rank here, threatening checkmate on h2. So we have queen h3 stopping the mate, rook to e1, takes, king g2, and now black can do a little bit of the ziggy-zaggy with queen to e2. We get king to g1, and now we have this move queen to d1 check, hitting the king. Now, this is apparently not the best move. The computer wants another insane move, pawn to a3, ignoring everything. Basically, the idea is to go after the pawn on a2 and push p on the a file. And white really can't do much. So if you go queen g2, you have the same problem with queen e1, trade, and g5, winning the bishop on f4. Again, with so little time for both players, I think a3 is just an insane move to play. And so Hans plays queen d1, knowing that he is going to win material. Makes perfect sense. So we get queen to f1. The reason for queen to f1 is if white goes king g2 here, there's queen c2 check, hitting the king and winning the bishop on c6 with another classic right triangle. So we get queen f1, takes, and g5, but the problem here is that now Alireza is able to capture this pawn on a4. So even though black gets one of the bishops, white now has a bishop and a pawn on the queen side, and with a limited number of pawns on the king side, the game should be a draw. So we get king to g2 here, king g7, bishop to b5, king h6, and now we have a4 being played. Hans trades the pawns and goes rook f5. Now, one big problem with this endgame, aside from the fact that white has this pawn on a4, is that even if black were to somehow win this pawn, this endgame is also still theoretically a draw, I believe, with white just waiting with the bishop on d1 and f3. I think that I actually drew an endgame very similar to this against Vedic Gujarati in one of the online chess champion tour events. So the fact that it's a draw, even without the a pawn, means that with this pawn on a4, it should be very easy. So we get bishop c6, rook c5, bishop b5, king g5, bishop d3, h6, king h3, rook c3, bishop b5, rook e3, bishop d7, rook e2, and now we get a bit of a yo-yo here with Alireza just yo-yoing the bishop on the diagonal, and eventually the game does end in a draw pretty soon after bishop b5. Now, to show you guys why this would be a draw, black can try h5 here, and if you play bishop b5, there is h4 to win the pawn on g3, but after white goes king to, I think both squares work, but let's just say h2 specifically, after rook a3, bishop b5, you don't want to push h4 because then it's always a draw with the bishop and pawn for the rook, and if you ever go king g4, I always will tickle the king, and then go king to h3 and king to h4 to win this pawn, and if you go back, I just keep yo-yoing all day long. So, after bishop b5, the game does end in a draw, and with that, Alireza drops half a point behind the leaders, as does Hans Niemann. So a very, very choppy game. Both sides had chances to win, but when all is said and done, it does end in a draw. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 5th round of the Grand Swiss being held here in the Isle of Man, and I will be back tomorrow with a recap after round number 6. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this recap or the channel in general and you haven't already, make sure to smash that subscribe button below, and I will see you guys all tomorrow after the 6th round of this great event. See you guys then. Have a good one. Bye.